Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our global webinar series at the Edge of the Margins. My name is Taina Bieneme, and I am the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, one of the oldest international organizations dedicated to ending the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women and girls worldwide. Last September, we hosted a conversation with a college student, a recent graduate, and a parent on the role of academia and its promotion of the sex trade, including prostitution, and its impact on our work post-graduation when the students go and fill so many offices with whom we work, as well as the media. If you're interested in listening to that conversation, you can find it on our website. I then received a call from the incomparable Dr. Gail Dines, founder and president of Culture Reframed, and critically acclaimed author of books such as the global bestseller Pornland and the world's expert on the multi-billion-dollar industry of pornography and its devastatingly harmful effects on women in particular and society as a whole. Dr. Dines suggested that we have a part 2 of our conversation about academia, but this time to focus on pornography. So it is a great honor to welcome today Dr. Gail Dines, as well as 2 other experts in the field, Dr. Carolyn West and Dr. Robert Jensen, whom I will call Carolyn and Bob, with all due respect, and Gail, of course. For the sake of time, I won't have the opportunity to further delve into the collective 90 years plus of scholarly work that these 3 professors and extraordinary advocates have accomplished. So I encourage you to read their short bios in our invitation and to delve further into their work. Briefly, Dr. Jensen is emeritus professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin and a preeminent scholar in the examination of patriarchy, feminism, and the sex trade, including pornography and prostitution. Dr. West is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and an expert in investigating the links between slavery and today's portrayal and exploitation of Black women, in particular in pornography and related sexual violence against them. In 2018, she produced the documentary, Let Me Tell Y'all About Black Chicks, Images of Black Women in Pornography, which I highly recommend you watch. Dr. Gail Dines will open the discussion today with a presentation to help us explore the fundamentals of pornography and how the industry hijacked, to use Gail's term, academia and the feminist movement. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to begin this roundtable discussion, starting with Dr. Dines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taina, and it's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everybody who's joined us. So I'm just going to share my screen. So what I'm going to be talking about now is how porn has become mainstream at the very same time that feminism has become more pornified. So the question is, how has this happened? Because if we ever needed a feminist movement that was anti-porn, it's right this minute. So, excuse me, I'd like to look at what mainstream porn looks like today. So first of all, what we know from the studies is that porn sites get more visitors each month than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined. So I just want you to think about the sheer numbers involved here. Now, when you're talking about pornography, you have to focus on Pornhub. And the reason for that, it is the most traveled porn website in the world. It's also considered the most kind of branded and chic porn website out there. It is owned by a global company called MindGeek that is actually based in Montreal. And if any of you have been following the media, you can see MindGeek for the first time ever has had the light shined on it by an article by Nick Kristof in the New York Times, and then also by many other groups who've been working to make sure that MindGeek takes responsibility for the violence that it perpetrates. Now, I just want to give you some Pornhub stats in 2019. They had 42 billion visits, up from 33 billion in 2018, a daily average of 100 million visitors, 962 searches per second. They uploaded nearly 5 million new videos. I mean, there are millions and millions of videos on there now, although some have been reduced because of the latest outcry. And they created in 1 year over 1 million hours of new content. Nobody, no matter how long they live, can ever get to see a fraction of all the porn on Pornhub. Now, Pornhub boasts that it has 100 million visits a day, and that is the combined population of Canada, Poland, Netherlands, and Australia. So just think again about the sheer numbers. Now, with the pandemic, they saw an increase to 134 million visits per day. The reason for that is, first of all, men were at home more during the day, and actually the peak viewing time was 3 a.m. So they were waiting till the family went to bed so they could access Pornhub. And also, Pornhub's gift to the COVID virus was to make its premium content free. Normally that's behind a paywall, but they decided to help men all over the world by providing the premium content free. Remember, that's more men looking at more pornography during a lockdown with women and children in the house. So no wonder we saw an increase in domestic violence. We saw an increase in the production and consumption of child sexual abuse images as well. Now, the premier study that's looked at 304 scenes of the most watched porn showed that 90% contained at least one form of violence against women. And this has recently been updated by Anna Bridges, and from what I hear, the statistics are actually higher. So just so you understand what we're talking about before I actually talk about the so-called pro-pornography feminism, I want you to get a sense of how violent pornography is. These are the main acts on mainstream porn that you can access within 5 seconds for free. And we know from studies that the age of first viewing pornography is 11. And in fact, I recently just read a study from England that's saying that kids of 7 are now being exposed to pornography. And that's the porn industry coming at the kids. Much of this first exposure is unintentional. So the main acts: gagging, where the woman is gagged with a penis so far down her throat that she actually is choking. The thing I should also add here is strangulation, which is different to gagging because strangulation is hands around the throat. What we know from that is that, first of all, women who are battered and strangled by their partner are more likely to actually die at the hands of their batterer. Also, we know that with strangulation, you can be strangled till you pass out during sex, which is really violence, and you can then wake up, and a week later you can go to bed, your passages can swell up, and you can die. So the effects of strangulation take about a week to hit the body. Very, very rough, pounding anal sex, to the point that for many women in the porn industry, they have to have their anuses sewn up regularly because they get anal prolapses. The standard scene, end of every porn movie, is ejaculation on the face by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 men. The woman is covered in semen in the eyes, everywhere. ATM, which is short for ass to mouth, where the penis goes into her anus and then into her mouth or another woman's mouth without washing. Hair pulling and spitting in her face. And it is very common to see your average scene on Pornhub. And we're not talking now about hardcore. We're not talking about that. That's called kink.com. Mainstream porn is what used to be called hardcore pre-internet. So it's very likely you see a scene of a woman being gagged, being penetrated orally, anally, vaginally, having her hair pulled, being spat upon, being called every name you can imagine, and then ejaculated on by all the men. So, given that's what pornography is, the question is, how did we move from the view that porn equals violence against women in its production and consumption to porn equals women's empowerment? What has gone on here? So, first of all, radical feminist theory. We were the first ones to really talk about violence against women in pornography. And that's because radical feminism has always been concerned about violence against women. So it actually grew out of the violence against women movement in the 70s and 80s. Remember what radical feminism used to look like? So this is Barbara Smith from the book called A Bridge Called My Back, which was one of the first books written by women of color around radical feminism. Feminism is the political theory and practice to free all women, women of colour, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, as well as white, economically privileged heterosexual women. Anything less than this is not feminism. It was a movement about the liberation of all women, not about the empowerment of individual elite women. The core of radical feminism is that women exist as a class, and who put it better than Andrea Dworkin? The fate of every individual woman is tied to the fate of all women, whether she likes it or not. This is again liberation, not empowerment, but liberation. And again, what did Andrea Dworkin say about pornography? She said, think about pornography as social control, as a democratic use of terrorism against all women, a way of saying to every woman, look down, bitch, because when you look up, you're going to see your legs spread. And I want to just, again, bring the focus to the fact we're talking about all women here, the collective understanding of women as a subordinate sex class. And we had wonderful books that came out from radical feminism about the harms of pornography. Andrea Dworkin, Susan Griffith, Not for Sale, Take Back the Night, books that really got to the core of a nuanced understanding of the impact of porn. And then we went down the rabbit hole around the 1980s when Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon wrote an ordinance to define pornography as a violation of women's human rights. And that's when the so-called liberal feminists started to organize against the radical feminists. And indeed, down the rabbit hole we went. Books started coming out called Bound and Gagged by Laura Kipnis, Defending Pornography by Nadine Strossen, Hardcore by Linda Williams. Now, many of these were out of the academy. And they talked not only about pornography should be protected as free speech, but also there was a beginning now in the 1990s and 2000 to talk about the positive elements of porn. And that was a real shift. So we went further down the rabbit hole from free speech argument to the positive impact of porn. And then we ended up about as far down the rabbit hole as you can get with the feminist porn book. And whoever thought they would live to see the day when all of those three words would be in one sentence? I never thought I would. So this is the Amazon review of the feminist porn book. It identifies the importance of pornography as a form of expression and labor in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. What the hell does this mean? Power and pleasure for who? Certainly not for the women who are forced into pornography or who sign contracts and having no idea what they're actually agreeing to. So this notion that somehow it is a form of expression and power and pleasure for women is absolutely ludicrous when you bother to speak to survivors of the sex industry. So what's happened is a structural view of pornography affecting all women has been replaced by an individualistic neoliberal view of women expressing themselves. This is the new pro-porn feminism, a neoliberal individualistic view. So this move is actually part of a larger shift away from radical feminism to neoliberal feminism. And this took hold during the Reagan-Thatcher years. Many of the young academics now were actually brought up during a time of neoliberalism, really harsh neoliberalism that these two visited on the world, and really have seen that as the norm. So let's give an example. Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. There are individuals, men and women. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. And especially now in the middle of a pandemic, we know there's no such things as individuals, only a society. That's how we function as human beings. And then mirroring that, the Third Wave Manifesto in 2000 in Alternet, which is supposed to be a progressive publication, they quoted Jennifer Bogon, who wrote, feminism is something individual to each feminist. Well, you name any movement that it's individual to each person who joins it. Let's say the anti-race movement is something individual to each feminist. The civil rights movement is something individual to each person of color. I mean, what kind of a movement would it be if everyone made up their own individual view? Or the labor movement is something individual to each worker. It would make no sense. And in fact, it would be a contradiction in terms, because you can't have a movement that doesn't have a collective ideology and doesn't have taken for granted assumptions. And they're not based on what individuals think, they are based on how the movement constructs the problem and the solutions. Now, in neoliberal theory, there is no structural inequality. There's no systems of oppression. There's no groups with collective interest don't exist. There's no oppressed class and there's no oppressor class. In neoliberalism, you just have lots of individuals making lots of individual choices with lots of empowerment and lots of agency. Now, of course, this is a joke, because the oppressor class, of course, understands that they act as a class. When they meet regularly at Davos to talk about economic plans for the next year, believe me, they're not discussing what they had for dinner. They are acting as a class. So what we have is that patriarchy and its shells, they both create the oppression of women while at the same time obscuring it as individual choice, empowerment, and agency. And I want to say these are important terms because there are some privileged women indeed who do have more choice, more empowerment, and more agency than other women. I mean, I have agency as an upper class, white, educated woman. What does that mean for poor women, white women, or women of color? My agency, in fact, probably was built on the backs of those women. So this is what happens when you get into an individualist account of how feminism should be, is you're really talking about the most privileged of women. This is how we ended up with the concept of sex work versus prostituted women, because sex work is a neoliberal individualistic concept. It renders invisible the exploitation of women by decontextualizing it from the economic, political, and legal systems of oppression that make women a subordinate sex class. Thus, if you talk about sex work, it looks like a choice of these women. And by the way, the term sex work, developed by the sex industry, was developed to legitimize Johns, to legitimize pimps, and it is absolute form of violence to the lives of women in the sex industry. It is not work, it is sexual exploitation, it is sexual slavery, and anyone who calls it work, if they're not in the industry at the time and being forced to do that, and if they're mainly in academia, believe me, they chose academic work over so-called sex work. And my argument to many of these women when I give lectures and they talk about sex work is, in the academy, I say, why did you bother going to get a PhD and spending all those years studying? Why did you bother to take out all those loans if you could have done sex work and started earning money at what, 14? Of course, those women are nowhere near having to work in the sexual exploitation industry, and nor are their daughters. So the question is, what do we actually want as radical feminists? And this has to be categorized into two things. Well, first of all, we want anything we can get to tie this industry down. And we call this a culture reframed the Gulliver strategy. Come at this monster piece by piece, any way you can. So in the short term, we would argue that you need governmental legislation that defines pornography as non-state torture. You need government legislation that holds porn sites financially accountable for the violence done to women and children in production and consumption. We need the withdrawal of all credit card payment systems, an end to so-called corporate social responsibility approach, which is self-regulation by the sites. No industry should self-regulate. Could you imagine what situation we've been in if the food and drug industry self-regulated? We need to hold platforms accountable for carrying porn. And very important, we need to add porn to the Nordic model because porn is filmed prostitution, and to enforce age verification at both the production and the consumption ends of the value chain. Now that's what we want in the short term. So my question to you would be, what do we really, really want in the long term? So let's think about the society as a pie. And so one of the arguments has been in feminism, look, men have had all the pie. We want, and this is the liberal feminist argument, is we want half the pie. It's not fair. So here's half the pie. And by the way, notice how unappetizing half the pie looks compared to the full pie. So who wants this? It doesn't look very tasty. The neoliberal pro-porn feminists, so-called feminists, want the crumbs. They are happy with any crumbs that patriarchy throws at them. What we really want is to deconstruct the pie. get rid of it, throw it out, because there is no way that in a patriarchal society we can have life sustainable for women and children. As long as we have patriarchy, we will have pornography, we will have trafficking, we will have prostitution, which really the two go together. We'll have violence against women in all its forms and children. This is not a side, a sort of offshoot of patriarchy. It is built into patriarchy. Violence against women and children is a form of sexual terrorism to keep women and children in their place. And as long as you have violence, you will have patriarchy. As long as you have patriarchy, you will have violence. There is no way within this system that we can get rid of all of these forms of violence against women and children while also keep just tinkering at the edges of the system. So what I'd like to say today is that as we see the porn industry, the sex industry in general grow, we see more and more so-called third wave feminists fighting to get us to buy into the empowerment and individual argument. I bought into a feminism that said, you know what? Even if I'm okay, even if my life is fine, I will walk miles, I will climb mountains, I will do whatever it takes if her life over there is not okay. That is the feminism I joined, and I'm sure many of you did. So the biggest thing we have to do is A, resist this faux feminism, B, start to organize as radical feminists so that we begin to think about serious social change on a macro level, and especially to realize the role that the sex industry plays in legitimizing and promoting patriarchy and violence against women. And we have to fight it with everything we have, because we cannot give our lives over to these predators. I refuse to do it, and I hope you do too. So thank you so much for inviting me to this, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Gail. That was simply amazing, to the point, powerful, sensical, and thank you for also for giving us a blueprint for advocacy. And you'll have an opportunity to delve further into these amazing points that you have made. Thank you again so much. My first question is to Bob. So Gail mentioned Andrea Dworkin a few times in her presentation, as you have in many of your lectures and writings. And there's one particular saying that she offered us, saying that a society that doesn't like to examine suffering or the pain of others is a society that doesn't want to recognize the links between pornography, prostitution, and violence against women, and also an affront to what it means to be human and what it means to reach one's full potential without violence and discrimination. What are your thoughts? I mean, obviously you're the preeminent expert on pornography, especially within the context of male violence, harmful masculinities, and sexual violence against women. What are your thoughts? Is failing? Sorry, is academia failing in recognizing the suffering of others?
Academia is failing in so many ways. We have to contain it. As someone who spent 30 years in academia, there's a long list of things I think the modern university system is not doing well. But Andrea, of course, was right on target to focus on suffering. There's always in every hierarchical society groups of people whose suffering is invisible. And of course, social movements have to a large degree tried to make that suffering visible, to force a moral accounting on the dominant culture. And if I can digress briefly from your question, as I was listening to Gail, I was reminded of the pain, not only, of course, of the women who are used in the sexual exploitation industries, but the pain of living in such a world. I was remembering a presentation I gave to a rape crisis center, and I thought, you know, these women at the rape crisis center, they've seen the worst of the worst of the world. They counsel women, including, you know, also boys and vulnerable men. They counsel people who've been abused in ways that are hard to imagine. And I thought, well, doing this presentation won't be hard for them. And it really hit them, as I described, as Gail did in her presentation, some of the actual images you see in pornography. And I remember one woman, an experienced rape crisis counselor, holding her stomach and crying and saying, "This just hurts so much." And I wanted to say that because even hearing a description of what is in pornography hurts. To know that this is not only the actions of, violent men, but the entertainment of an entire culture. Especially, I don't know this firsthand, obviously, but to be a woman and know that that use of your body collectively, and Gail emphasized the importance of thinking collectively about this, that use of your body is entertainment. I just wanted to recognize how hard this is. Some people think, well, it's just movies, but it does cut much deeper. The Academy has turned its back on that suffering. Gail, I think, did a good job of pointing out that there was a vigorous debate when she and I first got into this, and that debate has been largely eliminated. And I want to point out that in most women's studies departments that I'm familiar with, including the one where I taught, students who tried to raise a discussion of their concerns about pornography were not encouraged. Sometimes they were literally laughed at by other students. And the faculty did not support those students who were trying to raise these issues. The way in which feminism in the Academy has abandoned this issue, and by virtue of that abandoned women, is really stunning. Now, I make a point of not, criticizing women directly. I don't think that's really my role. But I do want to point out also one thing real quickly, is that this has given men in the Academy incredible cover. When I first got into this 30 years ago, men would defend pornography, but you could see the anxiety they felt doing it because, of course, they knew they were defending their own sexual pleasure that came at the cost to women. Now, with this postmodern liberal defense of pornography, in fact, as Gail pointed out, celebration of pornography in the Academy, academic men have license to not only use pornography and avoid accountability for it, but to now justify it as political radicalism. And it's devastated the capacity of the university to deal with this issue sensibly.
Thank you. So Carolyn, you have written extensively about the links between racism and pornography and the sex trade in general, particularly focusing on Black women. Here we are today in an environment where we have Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project and the remarkable book Caste and other books by Pulitzer Prize winning Isabel Wilkerson. Why is it that people are still accepting, like make an exception of pornography and the treatment in particular and the sexual violence against Black women? You're on mute.
That's such a complicated question. And I find myself asking that routinely. Why does this particular media area as a form of violence sort of gets a pass when we would not do that? Everything else is under critical analysis now, even after the George Floyd murder. Even images like Aunt Jemima was asking themselves, well, maybe we need to think more critically about the images that we're producing throughout society. But somehow nobody really wants to address what we see in pornography. And so it's been distressing to me in some ways to see the numbers when pornography is critiqued. A growing number of young Black women scholars seeing this as empowering and almost positive. And then there's nobody sort of talking about the other side of that. And I think what we're living through is sort of, if we talk about this and somehow we're kink shaming, that everybody should sort of kind of do their own thing. And if you critique anything in sexually explicit media, then you're shaming people for their sexuality. And I think another part of that is that it's more complicated and nuanced for Black women, because we are also dealing with this politics of respectability in some ways. Historically, we have always sort of been shamed about our sexuality, told we were sexually insatiable. So all of those images and stereotypes that you will find in pornography are deeply embedded in history. And so what the porn industry, I think, has done in a deeply disturbing way is they take it out of context. So you can show images of Ku Klux Klan members and the most horrific racial trauma, and you can sexualize it. And then we can tell people it's okay to look at this and be sexually aroused by it, because we're not looking at the historical trauma behind it. It's a parody. It's something sexual, so it's okay to enjoy it and not really critique it. And so there are multiple layers, I think, on this for African American women that we're not talking about. And we're especially not talking about in the academy. And there are fewer places to have those conversations. It's hard to do it in women and gender studies, and it's hard to do it in African American studies as well. It's a conversation that nobody seems to want to be having. And it's well past time that we actually do have a conversations.
Thank you. And this is a question for all three. So here we are at the eve of the inauguration of the next president of the United States after a tumultuous election period, to say the least, and a very charged and necessary conversation about white supremacy, white male supremacy, domestic terrorism. We as a movement to end the sex trade and commercial sexual exploitation of human beings who are mostly women and mostly women of color, how can we as a movement convey that what happens to women and other vulnerable populations in the sex trade is actually sexual terrorism for profit? Who would like to go first and explain that and use examples if you can? Do you want to start?
Well, I'll just say something real quickly. And I think this was alluded to by Gail, which is, what is the representative woman in the sexual exploitation industries? Is she somebody on, in a graduate program who did stripping for a semester to gather data for a master's thesis? Or is it the women, Taina, that your group works with, who are, of course, not without those opportunities? So, thinking about what is a representative sample and constantly recognizing there's diversity in human experience. The experience of every woman in the sexual exploitation industries is not the same, but there are also patterns. And we know what those patterns are. We know it from scholarly work, from research, and we know it from the experience of groups like the Coalition. These are women that typically are economically disadvantaged. They do not have access to resources. They have often disproportionately high levels of sexual trauma in their background, which we know has profound psychological effects. We know there are elevated rates of drug and alcohol abuse and limited access to education. That's the reality. Now, when we say that, people say, well, you're telling women who they are, and we're not. We're identifying the patterns. And I think trying to get that into the public conversation rather than the porn stars that the porn industry likes to hold up as images of empowered female sexuality is part of the question, I think.
it seems to me that the conversations need to be happening everywhere. You know, as a clinical psychologist and a domestic violence and sexual assault researcher, and also an expert witness in domestic violence homicide cases, so many times where I'm seeing the links between those domestic homicides or domestic violence and pornography. And we need to be talking with people who were too siloed in some ways. And I think we need to be talking with people who do domestic violence work, the link between that and pornography, the people who do sexual violence work, the links with pornography, the people who do trafficking work, the people who do racial justice work, and challenging them as well, that if you're going to talk about racism throughout society, this particular area doesn't get a pass, and to look at those images critically as well. So the conversation needs to be happening and the connections need to be made across various disciplines, and those of us who really care about social justice work in however form that takes.
Okay. So thank you. Carolyn, you finished? I didn't interrupt you. Okay, good, thanks. So one of the things that's happened in radical feminism that I think is problematic is there has been a tendency to throw out the concept of intersectionality. Now, I understand the reason for this is because intersectionality has become about identity politics as opposed to material reality. But when you look at the first analysis, really full nuanced blowout of what intersectionality was, it was actually by Kimberly Crenshaw to explain Anita Hill's position as an African-American woman and how there was no trope for her to stand up as a victim. She was either, quote, a mammy or a Jezebel. And and Kimberly Crenshaw's piece is really crucial in looking at the intersectionality of race, class, and gender. It wasn't about identity politics, it was about material reality of women's lives. So I think we need to bring this back in. We cannot have a feminism that does not look at the complex intersections between race, class, and gender. Now, in many cases, you know, when we're looking at class, you're looking at race, because often the two are sort of crossovers in a racist, capitalist, patriarchal society. But one of the things I want to say is all women have has a sort of target on the back. But the more of color you are and the poorer you are, the bigger the bullseye. And this is what we have to be talking about. As the bullseye gets bigger and bigger, these are the women we need to target. I also want to say that now we're living in COVID, we are going to see things we've never seen before, because what we know is that the high percentage of people who've lost their jobs are women, white women and women of color. And what's happening, it's increasingly more women of color, obviously, than white women. But what we know is that women are now flocking, because they've got no money, to things like OnlyFans, which are cam sites, etc. So and those jobs are not coming back. You realize many of these jobs post-COVID are not coming back. And so that means this is a long stretch of a shift in the labor force of women going into it. And I think what's going to happen is the porn industry, being the predatory industry it is going to start gobbling up all these women, because women will do anything to put food on the table for their children. They will do anything. And I totally understand that, because I too would have done that. So as you see jobs come back, you will see increasingly white men get hold of them, or maybe men of color when they get into more trades jobs, etc. But white women and women of color are going to be almost, unless they're really elite, booted out of the economic market. So we're going to have to really think through now how COVID has shifted this and where these women are going to go. And we don't want them to be basically targets for the sex industry.
May I follow up real briefly?
Yes, of course.
This question of intersectionality Gail raised, I think, is really important, and we're all talking about. In some arenas, it's become kind of a buzzword, and people say, well, I'm intersectional, without really articulating what it means. I would argue that the feminist critique of the sexual exploitation industries has always been profoundly intersectional. It starts with a critique of patriarchy and the way women's bodies are bought and sold by men. It's a critique of white supremacy, because especially in pornography, we see how racism is sexualized, how it's used to intensify the erotic charge for, in that case, primarily white consumers. And of course, what drives all this is the profit motive. It's a critique of capitalism and the way capitalism strips human beings of value outside the market. the feminist critique of pornography is the most profoundly intersectional critique you can imagine. And yet by the liberal and postmodern feminists, it's criticized for not being intersectional. It's just, reality is upside down in the academy these days.
And also, I think because intersectionality has been hijacked again by the liberal feminists, and it's all about how you identify and not about how you're located in the social structure, and that you can't identify out of poverty. You can try all you want, but you can't identify as a rich person if you've got no money, right? You can't identify out of being a subordinate class. You can try your best, but the reality is you are materially cemented into a subordinate position. And that's why we need, as Bob was saying, and also obviously Carolyn, we need this intersectional approach.
So of course I've got a million questions here, but this is the last one since we are running out of time faster than a horse leaving a barn. In December 2020, the French newspaper Le Monde published an open letter written by 3 French organizations in which they call pornography, quote, an industry whose methods are identical to those used in human trafficking, and citing that pornography was an alibi for hate, torture, and organized criminal networks. Along you, Gail and Bob, who have signed, who are signatories of this letter, the French Minister for Equality and several French senators and congresswomen also adhere to the letter. Do you envision the US ever coming to the same conclusion? And if so, what do you think it will take?
Activism, organizing, and a refusal to back down. That's absolutely what it will take. We are so behind the times here in so many ways. We don't even have sex ed. Right, that only in 13 states do we have sex ed that is scientifically grounded. The rest don't have it or isn't scientifically grounded. I think it's going to take, as Andrea Dworkin once said, and I think this is really important, she said, patriarchy strips from women the very thing they need to fight it, and that is courage and bravery. And I know the most courageous and brave women, especially from working in the anti-porn movement and the anti-trafficking movement. I think we're going to have to take all of our courage and bravery, harness it, turn it into something that is, I hate to use this word given what we're going through, contagious, but actually build a movement that is fearless and will not back down. Back down. And I know that Bob and I have been doing this for what, 30 odd years, Bob? I mean, we haven't backed down, and there's many people we know haven't backed down. Carolyn's not backing down. So and you're not backing down. So, it's a good start.
Thank you, Gail. Carolyn and Bob, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I didn't realize how much you would need to have courage to do this work. I'm a violence researcher, so I was going to challenge violence wherever I found it. But to tackle it within pornography, there are days that I was really surprised with the vitriol that comes with doing this work, which is even more important to continue. One question that was in the question and answer, how do you survive the academy? And how do you continue to have a voice with doing this work? And just some days are harder than others, but it's important to critique it in every arena where you find it.
Bob?
I would just say, I was just thinking on my screen, I'm in the middle and I have Carolyn and Gail on either side. And we're talking about the role of the university system, the academy, scholarly research. So Gail is an accomplished media sociologist. She, for a long time, edited one of the main readers, Sex, Race, and Class in Media. Carolyn has a distinguished career in domestic violence research, multicultural training. She has a whole other life in a whole other field where she's considered expert. I, at different times, brought both Carolyn and Gail to campus. And in both cases, we had great events with engaged audiences, but in both cases, the women's studies departments ignored. And that tells us something, that there's a certain fear of the engagement. The liberal postmodern feminists have won, but instead of from a position of strength, trying to engage to explain why we might be wrong, what they've done is a classic move, which is to use their power to eliminate the conversation. And that's the ultimate failure of the academy. I don't expect everybody to agree with me, but I do expect people to engage in good faith, an honest, empirically based critique. And looking at Gail and Carolyn again, their work is based in research, in data, and that's supposed to be the standard for the academy. And the academy is abandoning its own principles. And I think that's what we have to try to hold them accountable for.
And you know, as an advocate, I cannot thank you, we cannot thank you enough, all three of you as academics, for holding the fort, because what we struggle with every day is not just the organized criminal networks, but also the graduates of these universities that have been hijacked by the sex trade, and they populate legislative aid offices that then sponsor bills that want to decriminalize the sex trade. They populate the media that has an uncritical view of the sex trade and are actually functioning now as the mouthpiece for prostitution and pornography in too many instances. And the list goes on. And of course, you know, the upcoming political candidates who believe that the slogan, quote unquote, sex work is work, which means the full decriminalization of pimping, brothel owning, sex buying, sex tourism, et cetera, is the so-called progressive way to go. And as Gail said, it is, and you have said, it's actually the most regressive policy that is before us. So it is time for a Q&A. We have 10 minutes. There are a number of questions. I am I'm going to let Mariana give us some of the questions that have been asked.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Taina, and thank you to all our panelists. This has been incredible for all of us over at CatW. So I'm sure it's been as enlightening for our audience. So we do have a couple of questions, quite a few. Going off of the question that you mentioned, Carolyn, we have one student asking any tips for students or young academics for exactly that, surviving at university, especially given that so many college campuses are filled with groups like, quote, fetish society or pole dancing society. How do you beat the loneliness?
Well, I mean, as a faculty member, I teach a course on sexual violence in sex crimes, and I cover this material as a form of sexual violence. And so I create a space where when students want to talk about sex work as work, to give another view of another analysis of what that really means. And so trying to create an atmosphere where people can hear both sides, can hear all of the arguments and help them see that there is another side of this. I think that's really critical. And I know that Gail has worked extensively. You taught for many decades as well. And I don't know how you sort of tried to manage that.
Well, what I can talk about is, well, now I'm Professor Emerita, I stepped down to run Culture Reframed. And if anyone's interested, they should go to culturereframed.org, because we actually build programs to build resilience and resistance in kids to pornography. So what I used to do, and I had a lot of leeway in my college, so I would teach, all my classes were radical feminism, no matter what I was teaching, and also very progressive, obviously, if I was teaching about race as well as gender and sexuality. But what I would do, and this is what you have to find a teacher who will build a community with you. So me and some students started a women's center, and we kept it as a radical place where people felt really, women especially, comfortable. Now, other students didn't, and they went off and they built another center. I think it was called Gender or something else. But I think it's very important to find a professor who supports you. Now, there's not many of them out there, as we know that, and they're getting smaller and smaller. And one of the things I say to students, and I hate, this breaks my heart to say this, but actually, in most cases, avoid women's studies. You're much better off in sociology or psychology. And I'll tell you why. Because you need to have empirical data in the social sciences. Much of women's studies is based in the humanities, which means you can just spew out anything and nobody asks you for any data or to back up what you're saying. You can't do that in the social sciences. And I found sociology departments and psychology departments much more helpful in that you had to have the studies, the data. You couldn't just look at porn and say, oh, this is really interesting. It basically women's empowerment. You had to show studies on what happened to women in porn. So I would say for many of you, I'm sorry to say this, and believe me, as I said, it breaks my heart, stay away from women's studies. Unless you know there are feminists in there who have that position about pornography and the sex trade is violent, then you'll go nuts. You literally will go crazy having to sit through those classes.
And I would just add really briefly, I had a student who was struggling with this question of how to connect on campus. And with the ease of organizing online, she went off campus and created in the city, in the town of Austin where we lived, a radical feminist discussion group. And she drew a lot of younger people, but also some older people. So there was also some really healthy intergenerational conversation. The question is, of course, how to advertise it, how to make it known. And here I think we should recognize that the word radical feminism for some people still has very positive connotations. It signals a certain approach to how women are used and exploited. But if you're a young person and you've grown up being told radical feminism is, out of date, it's for those old, second wave folks, then it's a term that's going to keep you away. So I don't have a great answer for that, but I think trying to connect online and identify people who are not necessarily only on your campus can be one good strategy.
It's crucial, absolutely crucial. And also, sorry.
No, go for it, Gail, please.
Okay, I think connecting online, and when COVID hopefully passes pretty soon, is to start, and certainly we should think about this as having a radical feminist conference where we bring people from different locations. And now, because we're working so much on Zoom as well, you can build little kind of when we can actually meet in person again, little sort of cells of radical feminists in the area you live in. And I have to say, I grew up during the heyday of radical feminism. I was living in the States, I was in my 20s, and it was fantastic. We had radical feminist comedy, we had radical feminist book doings. I remember doing this fantastic event with Mary Daly, where we held all the patriarchs up in a court, and we made these paper mache with balloons heads, and then they had to say guilty or not, and the audience would say guilty or not, and they'd say guilty, we'd say off with their heads, and we would tend to decapitate. So it's not so funny now given what's going on, but at the time it was hysterical. I mean, we had such great events, and it was fun and nourishing and sustaining. And I feel so sorry for the younger women who are coming of age in radical feminism. They're surrounded by this third wave neoliberal, and they are so often attacked online as well as offline. So I would say find an online group like you, and then eventually in your geographical location, find a group as well. And by the way, also, I'm sure most of our Facebook pages are full of this. Mine's public, so anyone can go on there, and it's a good radical feminist space for discussion. So find places that are good spaces, otherwise you go nuts. You cannot do this alone. It's too much, it's too painful, and you think you're going nuts.
Well, thank you so much. That is very true. One question from the audience: Can you all recommend the best tone, approach, tools to talk to men in particular who don't see the problems that you've all described with porn, with strip clubs, with prostitution?
Bob, I think this is...
Yeah, well, I've always talked about two reasons for men to embrace a feminist critique. One is what we could call the argument from justice. It's the right thing to do. If you care about fairness, justice, if you care about the moral principles you claim to hold around things like equality and dignity, then you must embrace a feminist critique of patriarchy. In the same way that if you're white, you must embrace a critique of white supremacy. But you can look at the world and notice that people don't always do the right thing, that arguments from justice don't motivate 100% of the people. If they did, it would be a very different world. So I also have long made an argument from self-interest to men to say, listen, it's challenging when the way you've been socialized to be sexual, in fact, the way you get your pleasure in the world is challenged. But if you can face it and engage it, you start to recognize that the way we're socialized as men to treat women as objectified bodies, to treat sex as the taking of pleasure from women, right, is extremely limiting. In fact, it's depressing. In fact, if we actually get in touch with our own humanity, we realize the way we've been socialized to be sexual is destroying not only women, it's destroying us. Now, I don't want to equate the suffering of men and women in patriarchy, obviously, but what I try to argue to men is there is a benefit for yourself. There is self-interest in embracing this critique. It's hard. You have to struggle through a lot of your own socialization, but on the other side is a deeper and richer and more meaningful existence, a way to connect if you're heterosexual to women, although if you're gay, the same struggle connecting to another man, that there's a way to deepen your own life. And so I would make not only the argument from justice, but the argument from self-interest. And of course, I would do it without jargon. Another problem of the academy across the board is it's wedded to so much jargon that ordinary people feel put off by it. So I always try to talk as plainly as possible. And one last thing, I try to talk about my own experience, not because I think I'm so important, but because especially younger men need some model for how to live differently in the world. And if we're too afraid of talking about how we've struggled, not just how great we are, but how we've struggled and failed ourselves, it seems unattainable. So I think personalizing it and removing the jargon is the way I try to do it.
Anyone else want to comment in?
I do. If Carolyn, do you want to go? Okay. So what I usually say to my students, who are heterosexual and understandably wanted to partner with somebody, is you've got to raise the bar. I'm sorry, but we have given men such a low bar, right, because of the behavior that they do, and we expect so little of them. And what we need to, I think really women need to do is, you're probably not going to find a guy who doesn't use porn if you're younger, right? There's lots of very good TED Talks up there. There's one by Ran Gavrieli about why you stop using porn. There's a number of good TED Talks addressed to men around these issues. And there's Bob's book, absolutely read Bob's book, Pornography in the End, which is the latest one, Bob.
The one on pornography is called Getting Off, Pornography in the End of Masculinity, which has the advantage of being free and available online.
So definitely to read that. And then at some point, if he continues to use porn and won't listen to you, you walk away. I mean, you do. And I know that's not easy, and especially not if you're talking about kids, family, mortgage, and what have you. But to live with a man who is getting aroused by images of violence against women is to basically be soul destroying for you as a woman. Is how do you manage to get into bed with this guy and have sex with him when you know what's going around in his head and the images from porn? We know that from studies that when men have sex, the porn images come up. So I mean, women are in a really, really difficult position. And I have to say that in my classes, when gay men took my courses, they were in the same position as straight women. They couldn't find a man who didn't use porn, so they would have each other to commiserate with, but that's not enough of a solution. So I think men have to basically really behave as human beings, stop behaving the way they are, and also force other men to basically stop using violence, stop violence against women, and stop using pornography. Men of goodwill and good faith have to join this organization. You can't leave it to a bunch of impoverished feminists.
Thank you. Carolyn, do you want to comment?
No, there's some other questions.
Okay, great. Yes, there are plenty of other questions. So, Gail, you signaled you'd like to answer this question. How do academics respond when you point out that the academy focuses on neoliberalist feminism rather than radical feminists, which empowers all women? And does the academy readily recognize their neoliberalist views that negate the suffering of other women, or do they overall believe that they are empowering women?
Well, separate the academy into the students and the professors. Okay, the professors, no, absolutely will not give on this. They're not even aware that they hold neoliberal views, and will not entertain another way of thinking. The students, on the other hand, are completely different. They come to class with all of the, dominant hegemony in their head around neoliberal politics, around they don't want to be feminists, blah, blah, blah. And I have to say, I would ask my students on the first day, how many of you are feminists? And maybe one or two hands would go up. Then by week 4, they would be arguing with each other whether they were Marxist feminists, radical feminists, socialist feminists. They were trying to figure out which feminists they were. It was amazing working with students. And it's because patriarchy is like a house of cards. You take one out, the whole thing collapses. But for the professors, that house of cards has been glued together through many years of working in the academy. And they refuse to engage with us. I mean, I've had one woman shout at me in the middle of an academic conference, a well-known scholar, in a packed room. She stood up and she said, "Gail Dines, I withdraw your right to do this research." And I said, well, actually, you don't get to have that right. But this is the way they speak to us. Shout at us in the middle of things. I mean, who behaves like that, especially as adults? So, I mean, I could write a whole book on them. I'm sure many of us could, on the responses we get from our so-called colleagues.
Thank you. Any comments from you, Carolyn or Bob?
No.
Okay.
Carolyn, you know who that person was, by the way.
So we have a couple more minutes. We're just gonna keep on going for a little bit longer. So I hope you all can stay and continue to listen and send in your questions. So we got a question asking about, how do you and your community stay safe in an environment that wants you to agree with this movement to normalize, quote, sex work and pole dancing, etc., when you don't agree with normalizing this, and people start to troll you, the people in your group who may agree with you? Do you have any tips, any comments about how you handled these situations?
Yeah, it's certainly learning to develop a thicker skin and not take things personally. I'm still working on that piece of it. Although it's very difficult, because to look at these images, particularly as an African-American woman, it feels like a form of ideological violence. Some of it is just so deeply disturbing. And to realize that there are people, no matter how I conduct myself as an individual, people are going to see me that way in the world as well. That you can't almost divide those things. But I don't want to say it's the cost of doing business, because it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be you have to be unsafe in the world or feel like you're risking your safety to do this important work. But seeing the impact that it has on survivors and the clients that I work with, I can't not do it. So you find ways of doing that and protecting your emotional well-being along the way.
Yeah, of course.
Bob,
I think you want to say something.
I would say find somebody who looks like me and make them be your ally. So I was a white male, at one point a tenured and then a full professor. And a lot of people in those positions, they take this convenient out. They say, well, I don't want to speak for others. Go to people who look like me and say, damn it, it is your obligation to absorb some of this abuse. Because if we leave it to women or people of color to do all of the work because we don't want to get involved, we're abandoning our own responsibility. And I've understood this from the first day I worked in the feminist movement. My job was, because I was white and male, to stand up and say things that women and others were saying, but say it with the moral authority of a white man, and also be willing to take the consequences of it, because it's far easier for me than for others. And so whatever kind of privilege one has, and in my case, I used to say I have them all: white, male, educated, professional. My joke is, if I'd been born good looking, I would have had it all. You know, people like me have to stand up and guilt trip white men who won't do it, make them feel bad about themselves, shame them into doing it.
As well, you build a small group. So when those of us who started Stop Porn Culture many years ago, we would have an email list and we would help each other. All you had to put in the subject line was "in porn hell," and everybody would know how you felt and you'd get support. And then you have to develop a thick skin for this. You have to decide that these guys don't know who you are. I mean, you should see what my email looks like. I mean, oh my God. But they don't know me. They don't know anything who I am as a human being. They don't know anything about me as a mother. They don't know anything about me, how is my moral compass, how I live in the world. So they have no effect on me. And on the material side of life, we have a panic room in our house, which is bolted, steel bolted, because I have to protect myself given all the death threats. So that, and live off the grid and stuff. But that's become kind of normal now. So and that way, but again, I have the privilege to have that as a safe place in the home. If you're going to speak out publicly, you need to find ways to stay safe physically as well.
Well, on that note, I could have asked you a million other questions. This was such a rich conversation that went way too fast. Thank you for this enlightening, encouraging, just visionary conversation and thoughts that you have shared with us, Carolyn, Bob, and Gail. We celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. yesterday, who is highly, highly celebrated, but also his daughter reminded us that at the time of his death, he was the most hated person in America. And so with that, I just want to salute each of you and thank you for the courageous work that you have done, and especially on behalf of survivors, and the work that you do hopefully will prevent others from being sexually terrorized in the name of global profits. So with that, I thank you all. Thank you everyone who joined us, and this conversation will be found on our website, I guess, starting tomorrow. So thank you, stay healthy, stay safe, and much gratitude to each of you.
And
Bye.
thank you to the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and Laura and Mariana, who aren't visible but had a lot to do. Thanks so much. I mean, whatever we deal with, people on the front lines, of course, know even more so. So thank you so much.
And they're especially courageous because you're the ones who will embrace an anti-porn position, and that's not mainstream in a lot of anti-trafficking movements. So thank you.
Yeah.
That's what we do. Thank you all. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, so very much. That's it for us in our 6 At the Edge of the Margins virtual roundtable webinar.